I'm Cheyenne Bartz, and I'd like to spend some time talking about invasive species and how they not only affect biodiversity on every scale and can cause significant economic losses that can have a rippling effect across international trade, but also how they can create the platform needed for us to come together to form a united front of biologists, political scientists, and economists. I believe that without this multidisciplinary collaboration, our efforts to mitigate any damage already done and to stop any future invasions from happening will be negligible. Invasive species are non-native organisms that are able to establish themselves in a new environment and flourish. Not all non-native species are able to establish themselves, and even then, not all establishments of non-native species are considered invasive. In fact, naturally occurring invasions are relatively infrequent and often smaller. This is because there are several factors that are required for a successful invasion to occur. In the illustration provided, we can see that these are the basic factors required for all biological invasions, including human diseases. First, the species has to arrive, which is oftentimes stopped by geological and/or environmental barriers such as land or water masses and climate. Second, the species has to be able to survive long enough to reproduce offspring that can also survive to reproduction maturity, which means the species must possess either the specific characteristics needed for that environment or key invasive characteristics like fast growth and rapid reproduction, phenotypic plasticity, and being a generalist. Third, their population density has to become large enough to stabilize in order to become established, which often requires multiple introductions over time. Finally, after establishment has occurred, the species must cause damage or disrupt the existing biodiversity of the area in order to be considered invasion. Both ecology and epidemiology look at the frequency and magnitude of arrivals in order to help determine invasions or infection rates, as well as the impact caused by human interaction. In order to understand how a species is able to navigate these factors, and if an invasion is likely, the interactions with the population itself have to be taken into account. Population dynamics look at the size, number of individuals in a population, which are dependent on biotic, abiotic, and density dependent and independent factors, density or the number of individuals in an area, distribution or dispersal within an area, which can be clumped, uniform, or random, age structure or the portion of individuals in each life stage found by the demographics of the population, such as birth rate, death rate, and generation time, growth patterns or changes in population size or density over time, and the life history strategies, the cost and benefits within a stable or unstable environment, in order to predict the movement of populations. This seems like a lot. However, broken down into its parts, the concepts are not difficult to understand. There are a number of factors that limit the number of individuals within a population. Abiotic factors include non-living environmental conditions such as temperature, wind, altitude or depth, soil, sunlight, and the availability of water. Biotic factors include what and how much food is available, competition, predation, and social interactions between individuals within the population. Density-dependent variables include limited resources and habitats for individuals, disease that may spread through the population, and even pollution from the amount of individuals. I've included a picture of locusts because their numbers can grow so large so fast that they are often limited by density-dependent variables. Density-independent factors include natural disasters or environmental degradation and climate change. Population density refers to the number of individuals within a unit area of the overall range for the population. The daisy fields show how the range of population can be divided into quadrants or units for a better idea of how density is found. Quadrants can also help us visualize distribution or how individuals are dispersed within their range. There are three main types of distribution: random, regular, and clumped. With random distribution, there is an equal probability occurring anywhere and are caused by neutral interactions between individuals. Regular distribution occurs when individuals are uniformly spaced throughout, which occurs when individuals tend to stay away from each other. When individuals are attracted to a common source, they will form a clump distribution. In addition to how the populations move through space, we must also look at how populations change over time. By looking at the number of individuals in each age group or demographics, the overall age structure of a population can be seen here. In the diagram of 4 countries, the colored bar represents the age group and its size. When populations have large numbers in the sexual maturity age group, and the largest group is also the youngest, the overall population size is growing. When there are fewer individuals reproducing and the largest group is no longer able to reproduce, the population is declining. Survivalship curves also help us visualize the growth of a population size over time. Type 1 survivor curve is more what we are used to, with larger animals and those who tend to have low death rate up until the end of their life expectancies and high survivorship throughout their lives. Type 2 curve have a relatively constant death or survivorship rate throughout their life expectancies, where the Type 3 curve describes organisms with high death rate starting at birth. Over time, these factors will create an overall growth pattern for species in an area. Population growth patterns are the changes in population size over time. Birth rate, death rate, immigration into the population, and emigration out of the population can be used to calculate the intrinsic rate, or how fast a population grows per individual. This can then be used to find the population growth rate, dn over dt. Or the change in numbers over the change in time, equals the rate times number of individuals. Without any restraints at all, the growth of the species would be exponential, seen here in the red line. However, we know that there are biotic and abiotic limits to how a population can grow. In order to account for this carrying capacity, K, or the maximum population size the environment can support, is added. The formula for carrying capacity is 1 minus N over K. And it creates a logistic growth pattern shown on the graph here in blue. The interesting thing to note is that when the population size N is much smaller than K, the carrying capacity, the growth will remain exponential. However, when the population size starts to equal the carrying capacity, K over N will become closer to 1. 1 minus 1 would be 0, and growth rate stops. If the population does not limit its size to the carrying capacity, it will deplete its resources and cause the population size to fall drastically. This creates an overshoot and bust pattern. These are generally species that produce immense amount of very small offspring and are R-selected species, or R-strategists, the ones epidemiologists are most interested in. However, overshoot and bust patterns are not exclusive to R-strategists and can also be seen with predator-prey interactions, or the result of growth patterns interacting with each other. Often R-strategists and K-strategists, those whose populations are more slow to grow, but much more stable over time. Being an R-strategist or a K-strategist is a species life history strategy. The life history of a species depends on the age of reproduction maturity, the amount of reproduction an individual has throughout their lives, and the number of offspring produced in each reproductive event. Here we can see the types of organisms that make up each strategy. Below each organism you can see the number of offspring produced. Our strategists are selected for in environments that are unstable and therefore reproduce often and in large numbers to increase their chance of survival. Because of their sheer numbers, our strategist offspring are small but mature quickly and require little parental control. This allows the parental generation to spend more resources and energies towards staying alive and reproducing again. K strategists are selected for in stable environments and therefore can afford to spend resource and energy towards their offspring, helping to ensure the survival of each. They have less frequent and smaller sized reproductive events, and their offspring require parental care. However, this increases the offspring's chances of surviving to sexual maturity. The environment in which a species lives is the main driver for what type of life strategy it will have, so it can be fairly predictable. In fact, that is what population dynamic aims to do: predict the movement of populations in an area, and is often quite accurate. However, human impact on even one of these factors can throw calculations off drastically and make predictions more difficult. Human interference has caused the removal of some geographical and environmental barriers and has disrupted ecosystems, as well as increased the amount of arrivals that can occur over time, thus increasing the spread of invasions to the point of serious harm. This graph shows the frequency of different pathways facilitating the establishment of more than 400 alien species listed in the Global Invasive Species Database. Unaided is clearly the only low-frequency pathway for all types of species and is the only pathway not influenced by human trade, travel, or environmental disturbance. Once introduced, the very characteristics that make a species able to establish themselves are often what lead to their devastating impact on biodiversity in the area. Biodiversity and the effects of invasions can be broken down into three parts: genetic, species, and ecosystem. The duration of an organism's life cycle and the amount of genes available will help determine how quickly selection takes place. Without having new genes to select from in order to adapt, populations risk not being able to evolve and could ultimately face extinction. On the right, I have included visual of the loss of genetic diversity available for agricultural production. Without genetic variation available for the selection of new defenses, an invasion could cause massive destruction. Most of us are familiar with the Irish potato famine, which was caused by the pathogen Phytophthora infestans, also known as potato blight. Although already prevalent in the Americas and Europe, potato blight decimated the potato crops in Ireland primarily due to the fact that only one potato variety was being used for the majority of crops. Most pathogens and pests have at least some host specificity, where they will prefer a specific host over another, and can be partially controlled through planting and or breeding less favorable host varieties. Below we can see potato and tomato leaves from different varieties showing varying susceptibility to different strains of potato blights. However, simply using different varieties is not a solution to invasions, as eradication is difficult and costly, and often the pest or pathogen will be able to adapt, evolve into new strains, or reduce their specificity in order to invade more species that are more readily available. The parallels in epidemiology can be easily seen at this level, as human pathogens are also able to adapt and evolve, increasing the chances of infection. The only real difference being the time scale of the life cycles. Because true genetic variation, where perhaps a resistant gene could be produced, happens over time through mutations, is slow to increase even when the population does. Which brings us to species diversity. It has been estimated that over 1 million species are at risk for extinction, each a loss in valuable resources for us, whether food or material or pharmaceutical, or for the overall productivity of that ecosystem itself. More recently, loss of a staple crop due to an invasive pathogen can be seen with bananas. Like potatoes, there are many varieties of bananas that can be and are farmed. However, one major variety remains the staple banana crop in several countries due to durability and taste. The fleshy bananas used for crops are actually a mutated triploid and cannot reproduce sexually. They have to be propagated from a parent plant instead of grown from seed. This means that the vast majority of bananas produced in the world are almost the exact same plant genetically. This caused the commercial extinction in 1965 of an earlier variety, Gros Michel, that supposedly had better taste, when the fungal pathogen Fumaraceum oxysporum FSP cubanase, also known as Fusarium wilt, spread through crops in multiple countries. The current variety of banana, the Cavendish, was originally more resistant to Fusarium wilt and replaced the previous monoculture. However, the pathogen has now developed strains that can infect not only this variety, but many native banana varieties as well. Through this example, we can see the huge loss economically, as well as the potential loss of staple food resources in many countries, including those without adequate access and availability to nutrition. However, additional losses from invasive species can be seen on an even larger scale. Because the number of species and their population size contribute to the overall productivity of an ecosystem, loss of a seemingly benign species can have a cascading effect within its environment, affecting other species and cycles, which can eventually disrupt the entire ecosystem of an area and eventually the Earth. Because ecosystems are a delicate web of species, and species-habitat interactions, any shift, small or large, can create an imbalance. The only defense an ecosystem has against this comes from the amount of diversity available. Invasive species are not only able to disrupt the biodiversity of an area once established, many are able to use that loss to increase their spread. Without an abundance of native species in overgrazed shrublands, Bromus tectorum or cheatgrass is easily able to establish itself, continue the loss of biodiversity, disrupt the energy, nitrogen, nutrient, and water cycles, and ultimately change the entire ecosystem of the invaded area. One of the main reasons cheatgrass is such a good invader is its life cycle. Not only can it germinate in the spring and fall, it starts growing early in the season before many of the native plants. While this does have a benefit for grazing livestock, the amount of nutrients available from cheatgrass once matured is greatly reduced, and the coarse seeds are capable of harm, making the payoff slight. Being able to germinate twice allows for cheatgrass to increase their population size faster, while the early growth allows for them to outcompete native plants for space and water. Because a large portion of growth is not occurring when it is photosynthetically advantageous, cheatgrass can also end up using more nutrients. By reducing the amount of native shrubs, cheatgrass is able to reduce the amount of shade cover and increase temperatures by 10 degrees Celsius. Some have argued that the amount of biomass produced by such large populations in cheatgrass can restore nitrogen and carbon storage back into the soil. However, recent studies have found that although the soil organic carbon and nitrogen content was higher from the root systems, the overall soil organic carbon and nitrogen content was reduced with increased invasions of cheatgrass. Here you can see the different bars, black being the first and less invaded area, lighter gray being the second and slightly more invaded, and the third being the most invaded with cheatgrass. The level of reduction is obvious. In addition, cheatgrass biomass is often the cause of fires and can increase the frequency from 30 to 70 years down to 5 years, as well as increase the amount of time fires are more likely to happen. Here we can not only see that humans have a large impact on cheatgrass fires compared to native shrub fires, but that the fires are actually occurring earlier in the season. Agricultural examples help emphasize the negative effects of invasion. Recent times have shown us how upsetting it can be to lose some of our edible comforts, but the availability and accessibility of nutrition is absolutely detrimental to our very survival. Rising for the third year in a row, 2018 saw 820 million people go hungry, often in countries with already troubling economies. To add the cost of invasions on these countries' agricultural economies could cause catastrophic consequences with the potential of ricocheting around the globe through political and economic relations. The vast network of trade across the globe can be seen in this map depicting the top 100 trade routes for all food in 2013. Each flow line an indication of the relationship between countries, not only through agriculture, but also economics. The line graph on the bottom shows the increase in routes over time, indicating that this global network is only becoming more and more complex. Disrupting this flow of food and money across a multitude of countries can have a significant effect even on stable economies, especially when a large portion of agricultural gross domestic product is lost towards invasive species already. Last year in the U.S. alone, invasive species caused the loss of $40 billion in crop and forest production. That's 33% of the $132.8 billion agriculture contributes to our gross domestic product. But agriculture in the U.S. only makes up about 1% of our GDP. Other countries stand to lose much larger portion of their GDP to agricultural invasive species. In order to better understand the global impact of invasive species on agriculture, Paini et al. Found the potential cost of almost 1,300 known invasive insect pests and pathogens for the top 75% of crops in 124 different countries. Before we get into more detailed math, I would like to point out that the subtext is pointed out here and here, and I tried to make note of it everywhere just to make it a little less confusing. Species here is indicated by S or P on the other page. Crop will be C, and threatened country is T. Because the number of invasive species in a country has consistently been shown to relate to the gross levels of trade, the value of each country's mean importation divided by the overall import trade value from countries provides the arrival index for threatened countries. The establishment index was found by using self-organizing map to analyze a matrix using ones indicating species present and zeros indicating absence, created from the distribution of the 1,300 species in 124 countries. The mean annual value of each crop for each country was obtained from the Food and Agricultural Organization and then ranked by value. The top 75% of crops were then found. CABI-CPC, an international database, was then used to find all the associated pest and fungal pathogens for these crops. The invasion threat, or probability of invasion, for each country was found by multiplying the likelihood of arrival of invasive species by the likelihood of establishment. Multiplying the sum of all possible invasive species by the probability of invasion of a threatened country gives the total invasive threat for that country. This was done for all species from all sources, the total threat TP, per crop by all species for threatened countries, total threat TC, and overall threat OTT for crops in a threatened country by all possible species. Before crop invasion costs could be determined, the mean potential impact of each species on each crop in each country was needed. Paini et al. Established the potential impact of a species on a crop in a country, again obtained from the CPC database, sampled this range 100 times, and took the mean potential impact. The crop invasion cost of all invasive species on a crop from a threatened country could then be found by multiplying the mean potential impact times the total invasion threat per crop by all species by the mean annual crop value. By adding the sum of each crop's invasion cost by in a country together, the total invasion cost was determined for each threatened country. To estimate the total invasion cost for source countries, the same calculations were done, only using export values instead of import, and invasive species found within the country rather than outside of. Here you can see the countries with a high likelihood of being invaded in red and orange. 1/3 of the countries in the study are likely to have future invasions, and only 10 countries had a low enough threat that an invasion would be unlikely to happen. They found no real patterns in the countries that had a higher or lower overall threat value. This can be explained by the complex relationships between the kinds of crops grown in a country, the levels of trade with other countries, and the particular invasive species present in those trading countries. Large agricultural producers, China, United States, India, and Brazil, showed the highest potential cost from invasions. However, these large producers also have the ability to mitigate these invasions financially with pest management, plant breeding, crop substitutions, imports, or subsidies. To provide an estimate of this mitigation, the country's total invasion cost was divided by its mean GDP. Total invasion cost as a proportion of GDP clearly showed the countries that were most vulnerable to potential impact of invasive species. Unfortunately, most of these countries are also highly ranked developing sub-Saharan African countries. Because of the percent of GDP from agriculture, these countries stand to lose the most from invasions, while only being a small threat to other countries. While wealthier regions that do not depend as much on agriculture have a much smaller invasion cost, even when they have more threats. China and the US were found to be major source countries, hosting over 50% of the pool of invasive pests and pathogens. Because of this, they were ranked first and second as the top source countries and are considered central to the global network of agricultural invasions. Germany and France were also found to be potential source hubs, followed by Japan and the Republic of Korea. Considering the current pandemic that has spread across the globe and how the same principles of ecology are used to study both invasive species and emerging infectious diseases, it is hard to imagine that these findings are specific to agriculture. The results from this research should be considered detrimental to our very survival. Therefore, those countries who pose a larger risk to causing invasions, but who can afford to not only mitigate the risk, but also fund further research, should be obligated to do so. Through this study, we can get a better understanding of the truly global impact invasive species have on almost every aspect of our lives. We can also see that humans have a significant impact on invasive species, proliferating their spread around the world. This stands true for infectious diseases as well. Because their negative effects are worldwide and are greatly increased by human interactions, it is increasingly important to produce and share research on a global scale so that we can work together to form the united front that is needed in order to combat the spread of invasive species. Global research can help emphasize the universal impact and the devastating cost invasive species have, and push us towards international and interdisciplinary cooperation in creating the policies and regulations needed. For fun, I've included a couple of different images, one of the economies over time and a couple of different maps that you can see shipping and air travel. And if you notice, there's so much of it around. The actual map of land is not included, it's just the negative image. Thank you so much for listening and have a good one.